You should make a beer taste like bourbon. Bourbon's this thing, beer's this thing. They shouldn't cross over. And we said, that's garbage. You know, we want to make the best beer we can make. And we don't really care if anyone's made it before or not. We just want to make great beer. I've always been a number guy, you know, and I still try to jump in cab number 2000 if that's over there and there's one in front of me that's 762. I'm waiting for 2000. I don't know, that's odd, but that's me. So for batch 1000, it had to be really special. I used to live on Fremont in Wisconsin. Then every day I'd wake up, walk to Goose Island. Right about here, I turned, I could smell something, I wasn't sure what it was. Might have been tires burning, there's just a little bit of smokiness on the air. I was asked to participate in a beer, bourbon, and cigar dinner, and they sat me right next to Booker No, who was representing bourbon. He'd been the master distiller at Beam for a long, long time, and we started talking, and I knew right away I needed to talk him out of some barrels. But he was excited that there was a young man in Chicago that was interested enough in what they were doing to ask him for some bourbon barrels, because nobody had done it before. As soon as I got past the L tract here, I was pretty sure I was smelling that Bourbon County Stout we fermented the night before. I was number one, excited, and immediately following, scared to death that if it's fermenting this robustly, perhaps something went wrong. How many more times must I try my crimes of long ago? We wanted to make as big a beer as we possibly could. I didn't know how much malt was going to fit in here, so there was so much malt that at the end it started coming out of this door, so I had to throw some towels on here real quick and close it up and bind the door to keep the rest of the mash from flowing out. I was hoping it would ferment out in 10 days or so, but it's done in about 4. Man, I'm going home. Looking through the old brew logs here, 7/31/97. Here's an old batch of Bourbon County Stout. Mashed in at 6:17 a.m. and cooled in at 8:17 p.m. So a nice 14-hour brew. Yes, the good old days. Good old days. When the finished beer was going into the bourbon barrels and forcing that nice bourbony air that's been sitting in that bourbon barrel since it got dumped, boy, that was a great smell. So that got us excited. I think we all had big smiles when we finally pulled it out of the bourbon barrels and said, you know what, this indeed will be a memorable batch 1000. Said a race around the world, honey, just to see you smile. We put it in Russian Imperial Stout, and we got DQ'd, you know, not true to style, odd flavors, smoky flavors, too sweet. And then we got other people saying, this is the best beer in the competition. This should win a gold medal in something, I don't care what it is. Intense, licorice, coconut, you know, stuff that people were not used to using as beer descriptors back then. They were using for Bourbon County Stout. Said a race around the world, honey, just to see you smile. This was our one special batch 1000. You know, at the time we thought we'd never make it again. Looking at the pouring, well, it's got the best of me. Said we're sorry, boss man, me and B just got to leave.
My wife took me down to Bourbon County once, and the minute I walked up to that first rick house, there's just this breeze, and it just hits you right in the face, and I was hooked from that moment. It's this beautiful aroma, and just hearing the stories and seeing the way in which people care about it, it was amazing, and I've been hooked on bourbon ever since. There's a lot of misconceptions about bourbon out there. A lot of times people will sit at the bar and ask what the difference between bourbon and whiskey is, when in fact bourbon's just a category of whiskey. People think often like, oh, it has to be from Kentucky, or there's certain other kind of myths out there, when in fact really there's just three things that are necessary to be called a bourbon. Has to be made in the US, it's a distinctly American product, has to be made from a mash of at least 51% corn, and has to be aged in new charred American oak. The history of bourbon is tied up completely with the history of the United States. The name bourbon actually comes from kind of post-revolutionary times when Americans had this fascination with the French. So when you're in Kentucky, there are towns that are named after French places and French people, but they're all horribly mispronounced. So bourbon is named after the Bourbon family, but of course we call it bourbon. Is that fascination really took over and named the region where this whiskey was originally coming from. They say that it started in that area because when Thomas Jefferson was the governor of Virginia, there was like a homestead law that was passed where if farmers grew a certain amount of corn to lay claim to that land, they were able to keep a certain amount of acreage. And so when they were doing that, they ended up with extra corn. And these were Scots-Irish immigrants coming down from Pennsylvania and New York State and Maryland. And so they already had a distilling culture and a distilling history. So they naturally became farmer distillers. You had the upheaval of the Whiskey Rebellion, and you saw legal battles happen within politics defining a spirit, which is one of the most highly regulated as to what can be called that, and what can be called straight whiskey, what can be called blended whiskey. You saw the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. You saw the Taft decision where the US president just got involved in a dispute between rectified whiskey makers and straight bourbon makers and said, you now can call this this, and you can call this this, and those standards are still held up today. Imported spirits became much more popular, single malt scotches, things like that. And then bourbon makers in the late 80s, early 90s kind of recognized that and decided to kind of show people how good they can do by offering different products. Elmer T. Lee came out with Blanton's Founder's Reserve, the original single barrel bourbon. Booker Noe, Jim Beam started coming out with Knob Creek. We saw Elijah Craig come from Heaven Hill Distilleries. We just started seeing American whiskey makers show the world that our products are just as good and highlight the best of them. Around that same time, it was the late 80s, early 90s, we were seeing this same kind of craft beer movement. We saw amazing breweries like Goose Island, Deschutes come out in '88 and really kind of revolutionize the craft beer market, and consumers just started kind of moving towards well-crafted, high-quality product. And so the relationship between those two is kind of great and kind of natural. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen kind of a resurgence in cocktail culture. For a long time, I think people were making drinks to mask the flavor of a spirit. I remember growing up and people saying, oh man, this is so good, you can't even taste the liquor. And I think we're seeing people go the other way in a really great way. When we make a cocktail, we want to emphasize the flavors that are already natural in the spirit. And we don't want to mask any of those, we want to emphasize them. There's some good kind of byproducts of some of the laws that exist in bourbon. You know, those barrels can only be used once, and so they have to be discarded after the bourbon is made. And so who better to make use of them than these new craft breweries trying to do cool stuff? And so we end up with amazing bourbon barrel-aged beers, and there's still a lot of life left in that barrel. And so it's just wonderful that we can take that barrel and follow it along its life and see it go from making an amazing bourbon to go ahead and then making an amazing beer right behind it. I mean, I immediately get coconut and vanilla right off the nose. You know, bourbon barrel vanilla flavor, but the coconut is something different that I think could only come from the beer bourbon combination.
We have a phenomenal forest here in the United States. Missouri's been blessed with a good type of wood for what we do.
So white oak is the only species that you make barrels out of.
You have to have relationships with the lumbermen and women that will go out into the forest and choose the trees. They have to be a certain age. They have to be a certain type. It has to be white oak, usually from the Ozarks, around the Missouri area. You find a lot of the cooperages in that area.
White oak grows good all around this area. Even up by the Missouri River at Herman and New Florence, places like that, you've got good white oak. It'll bend to where, like a black oak, it'll bend, but it'll break. And the black oak has got way too thick of pores. It's not no good for a barrel because it leaks. And this is a good white oak tree right here. That's probably a 24 to 26 inch tree, and it doesn't have a knot on it up a good 10 foot. That makes 3 good staves. That makes it a real good log.
It is a generational business in most cases. A lot of these boys, their whole life, all they've ever known, all their families ever known is logging, and that's how they've made their living.
I'd say 3/4 of the people around town are loggers. That's just a way of living. My dad was a logger, and when I grew up, you know, that's basically what I knew what to do. Times were a lot harder back then than they are now. You just didn't make as much money. You know, you could work and work and work, and there just wasn't the money.
We have a good, healthy forest. It's growing faster than we're cutting it. We're seeing the better, more mature trees now than what we've ever seen. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've seen the best quality timber today that I've ever seen in my life. It just keeps improving because nobody burns their forest off anymore. They know to take the mature trees out that's gonna die anyway and let the young trees grow back, and by doing that, every 20 to 30 years, you can harvest the timber out of these forests.
When you pull up here and you get out, you walk down here and you see a nice tree like this, you know this is a tree to cut. When you see a smaller tree like that one, you know that tree's not big enough to harvest yet, so you don't mess with it. You try to cut it 16 inches chest high. That way in 20, 30 years, you can come back and cut it again. If not, if you just go in there and clear it, it's gonna be 100 years before you come back. Each one of them rings is a year old. So if you count 100 rings, that tree's 100 years old. I like the way a job looks when you're done. I don't like to see the trees all skin up. And it's just a satisfaction of knowing that you've done a good job. It's pretty impressive, you know, to sit back and go in the liquor store and look at all the whiskey and think, you know, I probably cut some of the logs that these whiskey was in.
McGinnis, and this is McGinnis Wood Products here in Cuba, Missouri. I started stave milling in 1955 and didn't know what a white oak tree was. It's family business. My best friend's my dad. We do everything together. We travel together, business, play golf together. It's never been a job. It's always been just a fun world.
Don't come too close and don't you be rude.
At the time we started building barrels, everybody told us we was crazy because it was a dying business. And today it's a phenomenal business, but it was a pretty good roller coaster ride getting to this point. This is wood that's just started aging, and so it still has over 2 years before it will be what we consider true air-dried wood. It pulls the acids out of the wood, which changes the flavors in your whiskeys and your wines.
Barrel making it's an art. It is a craft that's passed down from generation to generation, just like it is making beer or making whiskey. You just don't learn that by reading a book.
The wood has to be cut proper, the right thickness, the right grain, and it's a step that has to be done to be able to make barrel. The steam softens the wood enough that we can bend it.
There's no nails, no screws, no grooves. Those staves are all different sizes. And the last piece of the puzzle is the most important piece, because that's the size of the stave that's going to complete that puzzle. And all that has to be done in a decision of a couple minutes. So you just don't teach that overnight. And once that barrel is made, just like a fingerprint or a snowflake, no two barrels are the same. But the challenge to the cooper is that barrel's got to be the same as that barrel.
And after we steam the wood, we put it over heating pots to dry it back out to take the stress out of the wood. If you don't take the stress out of the wood, and a week later it'll straighten back up if you take the hoops off of it. After we truss it, we shoot propane in on it, set it on fire, and then we let it naturally burn there 30 seconds. It takes about a minute to a minute and 5 seconds for number 3 char. That's pulling the vanillins and stuff out of the wood, give the flavors, leave the flavors in for the whiskey. When we put the second head in, we put a little water in the barrel to get the heated barrel to turn to steam so it starts swelling the wood to make sure everything's tight at the final assembly. Well, I was one of the only kids in school that couldn't wait for school to start because we had to work all summer. So when school started, we got out of work. We didn't have to work. I had no intentions of being here. I was the youngest of 3 sons, and I always tell everybody I just wasn't smart enough to leave. 40 years later, I'm still here.
It's been a nice setup. We have the 6 kids that have good stock in the company. And we've never had a contract, nothing on paper, just word of agreement.
And it's always been, we agree to do something and we do what we tell people we'll do. And that's what I noticed in that beer was it gave me a lot of different flavors and a lot of different taste profiles that you don't see in most beers. I really enjoyed it. Very smooth, very good, lots of different flavors. We've seen so many changes. We see Scotland using a lot of wine barrels now and stuff, which used to they didn't. So it was just a matter of time before people come with these ideas and started making them work. The money starts off going to the landowners first, which are local, to the loggers, to our employees, and to us, and all the money basically is made here, generated here, and spent here. I guess you could call us old school, because that's just part of making bourbon.
You know, obviously, bourbon has its roots in Kentucky. Bourbon is just exploding here domestically and globally. Making bourbon or whiskey in general is very similar to making beer in the early stages, which is, you know, your primary ingredient is grain. We source all of our corn from local farmers that are all found within about a 40-mile radius of here. And the great thing about working with the same farms and families is they know what our expectation is and they meet it. You know, right now we're running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What that allows us to do is an actual 27 cooks in a 24-hour period. We have our own proprietary strain of yeast that we've been using for 7 generations. And once we get the yeast in, we kind of just back off and let nature run its course and then drop it for distillation.
We showed them ladies looking through the back. Guitars in hand, sides and hops in our pack. Not to the
So when we drop a fermenter, we can run and distill about 260 gallons per minute.
just sitting on something, shaking on down with the deep fried blue Delta sound. Then they'll send me and we'll pay back in space. Buy us some whiskey and we'll pay you in trade. Guitars do the talking, so gather round and listen to our songs of love, loss, faith, and redemption. Just sitting on something, shaking on down with the deep fried blue Delta sound. Hey, we got a boom, baby. Then we're gonna take the roots of this town, gonna stomp your boot heels on the ground. Hey, you got a groove, baby.
American white oak is extremely plentiful in the Midwest. You just get a very balanced, consistent maturation. That spirit is going to go into that barrel and it's going to be crystal clear. So it's going to look like a vodka when it goes in. But when you char the inside of that barrel and you caramelize those wood sugars as that barrel expands and contracts with the different temperatures of the seasons and it goes in and out of that caramel layer, that's where it gathers all of its color. And then obviously a lot of the flavor. We're mandated to only use it one time, so that's all we're going to use it. But at the same time, we're providing a supply for all these other industries, whether it's your rums, your tequilas, the Scotch industry, what Goose Island is doing. I mean, it's great to see that bourbon on there and the fact that we have a tie to that. We like the fact that people acknowledge that they're using our used barrels because we still think they have a lot of value no matter what age it is. What's unique about some of the other people that will repurpose the barrel, they will steam that barrel. If it's just a once-used barrel, they want to steam it and try to pull a lot of that whiskey characteristic, that bourbon characteristic that exists inside the oak. You guys are taking the flip side of that, which is no, we actually want that, and we want to use that to add character to our beer. The barrel never really dies once we're done with it. It's good to know that it's going to go somewhere else and take on another life.
I threw up when I woke up, brushed and had a smoke out on the balcony. The shoes have paid my dues up, now I rush through the advance they sent to me.
Bourbon County Stout is a standard in the industry for the category that it's in. It was the original at what it does. The balance of the beer, in my opinion, and I'm honestly not just saying this because I work here, is second to none. It's excellent, the way the whole thing comes out in the end. The importance of it for us, in addition, was that it was one of the original major innovations that we had come out of Goose Island.
BCS into our schedule 2 to 3 times a week now. And it's a pretty big chunk of that time just because of the sort of the labor-intensive and time-intensive piece of it. It's not an easy beer to brew in the brew house, and it's not an easy beer to ferment in the cellar because it's so strong. We don't add any sugar to this beer, it's all malt. So it's a lot of hand loading bags of malt into our little bag hopper, into our mash mixer, which pretty much maxes it out. You can open it up and it's got about this much freeboard from the top before it overflows. In this case, we have 2 mashes that contribute to 1 kettle full volume. And then bring it up to the lauter tun and running it off. I'd call it a first runnings brew. The wort that comes off is very high strength. As soon as it starts to curve off in strength, we pretty much have what we need. So it's a very inefficient brew that way. And then in order to get that gravity up to where we need it to be, it takes about 4 hours of boiling. And it takes a long time because of the slow process in the brew house to actually fill the tank. So fermentation begins after the first couple turns go in the tank, and then there's 4 more coming after that. And with all that available sugar, the yeast just go off. So you get this very rowdy, somewhat rapid fermentation, but really, really rowdy. We have less than half the tank full. We'll have excessive amount of foam over at high Kreuzen. So you end up with this really rich, big body in the beer. That really sets the backbone to be able to support not only the high alcohol, but the intense bourbon character that we pick up in the barrel. We use the same care that we've used since the beginning for it. I think people want to make sure that it goes well. They want to hit their specs like any brew, but this one's tricky because the boil is so long and you're evaporating off so much water to condense it down into the strength that we need that you have to be really aware and make sure that you're getting it boiled down to a point right where we want it. And it's a huge beer to ferment. So anybody that's in the brewing industry knows that making a beer of this strength is always something you need to pay close attention to. It's kind of cool that we've come to this point where a beer that's so difficult to make and so labor intensive on the front end and through fermentation is something we do regularly. So we've got it pretty well in hand at this point. You know, do we still get excited to brew it? Of course. You know, there are some folks who think that the base beer is not that exciting. It's like the beer hasn't reached its full potential. Without the recipe being so robust, you wouldn't have such a nice process through aging and such a nice end product as well. We have a high demand for this beer, and we're trying to make as much of it as we can. The stevia area helps us to do that. We're more efficient. We can move the beer throughout the brewery just fine and get it onto a sanitary tanker, move it over there, and then we can fill a lot more barrels in a single day. We can do it more efficiently, more safely. It's great to be able to make more of it. So the efficiency piece goes up, so that's really where we win. You know, when you have somebody who tastes this beer and they say, "That's a great beer, where can I get it?" And I have to look at them and say, "You can't?" It's kind of like telling somebody there's no Santa Claus, you know? Maintaining the quality, maintaining the traditions, not changing anything. We like it. I don't look at that beer and say, I wish it was a little more of this or a little more of that. It's Bourbon County Stout, you know? As far as, you know, the amount of intensity and labor and all the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into it over here, there's a lot that happens in the barrel as well. And one of the hardest parts about Bourbon County Stout is waiting for it.
What makes this beer so good coming out of the barrel? There's a thought process behind the recipe for it to be an ageable beer. What we're trying to do is round that product out over time.
It's really designed to go into a bourbon barrel and to age.
That's what makes this beer so unique and special, is flavors that we want to be developed in these previously used bourbon barrels. It's a 133,000 square foot warehouse designed specifically for Bourbon County Stout and barrel maturation and aging. It's about 1.5 miles straight drive from Fulton. Once all that beer is in the tanker, the driver hops in the truck and drives it over here. Our team is here on site waiting for the truck. We hook up our pumps and our lines and transfer straight from the tanker into our 200 barrel holding tanks. We got a certain section in front of the warehouse that's called our process floor. On that red floor, that's where we fill all of our barrels and empty all those casks. And then we take them to their designated spot out in the warehouse where we have it non-temperature controlled. And that's where they're gonna sit until we deem them ready to be racked. And that time can be, for the most part, 8 to 12 months in the cask.
You can't make Bourbon County Stout without bourbon barrels. We've got a certain specification that we hold to, and that's at least a barrel of 8 years. And we think that makes the bourbon with the most character. They're tougher to get. It used to be we'd have all Heaven Hill barrels. Heaven Hill makes great Bourbon County Stout, but we've got Buffalo Trace barrels, we've got Barton barrels, we've got various Beam brands. They all make great Bourbon County Stout, but there's differences to each one.
We don't do any sort of rinse or steam on these casks. If we're lucky, there's still a little bit of uncut or devil's cut bourbon in there. We put the beer right on top of that. As we're pouring that liquid into these casks, it starts absorbing into the pores of the wood fairly quickly. What makes Bourbon County Stout stand out is the location that we're at. Chicago has really hot summers and really cold winters. So this beer, once it sits in the barrel, once it gets put in its location in the warehouse, that room is non-temperature controlled. So we want it to go along with the seasons. The wood is a porous substance. So in the summertime, whatever liquid's in the cask is going to get saturated in every aspect of that stave of that wood. We're trying to touch every layer of the wood that bourbon was able to touch because we want those flavors to be imparted in Bourbon County Stout. This is any brewer's aging maturation dream location. It's amazing. The space is so big, but it's getting packed. It's getting filled really quickly. Managing this amount of barrels is a little cumbersome. We're pretty much babysitting the barrels. They're like your children. About 6 months in, we start getting samples of the beer to see where the ABV is, where the alcohol content is, how the aromatics are coming out, and then just how that flavor is developing. Once we see fit that the barrels are ready to get racked out, we pull those barrels out to our process floor. We rack it. Racking is the term we use to empty a cask. We transfer that liquid out of the holding tank back into the tanker truck. From there, the tanker gets driven back to Fulton, and that's when it gets carbonated, and then from there it gets bottled. I've been brewing beer for over 10 years. I never thought a brewery would ever have this many barrels. So to be able to play a major role in what I consider one of the best barrel aging programs in the world, there's nothing like it. And like with anything that anybody does in this world, you want to be creative. You want to showcase other ideas and innovations. We're always doing small batch innovation. We probably have 150 single barrels. It puts a smile on your face and you know why you're doing what you're doing.
idea behind the variants largely has been to highlight flavor elements that are already within Bourbon County Stout.
That's one of the great things about tasting just straight classic Bourbon County, is you can go through a glass and each sip is telling a little bit different story. You're getting coffee, you're getting vanilla, you're getting dark fruit, you're getting some coconut, and if you zero in, that's what you taste. Taking all those flavors and then making variants to really play up those flavors, I think that was one of the things that worked out really well with Bourbon County Stout.
Outside on a cold corner, smoking after I set.
I didn't light the torch for Bourbon County Stout, Greg Hall did, but we're carrying the torch now. It's a personal pride for maintaining the quality of it.
When we talked about the variants, we said, what flavors jump out at us? And coffee is one that obviously always jumped out at us a little bit.
Each year it's been a different coffee, and that's part of the beauty of coffee is you can do a coffee variant every year, but always have something new.
I think that was our first one that we played around with, and we just had on our innovation team a bunch of really creative people, and we happen to have the best coffee roaster in the country next to us. We share a block with them. So the westernmost part of Goose Island is the easternmost part of Intelligentsia. So it's probably the best brewing block in America.
So the process is an engagement of all the brewers. These guys work at Goose Island not just to throw bags of malt in a hopper, but for the creative side of being a brewer at Goose Island. And I think that's an important part of their jobs, an important part of my job to bring them in.
We get a few cases of BCS and we give everybody a 4-pack and we tell them to take it home and experiment with it. And they can bring back a trial that they made on their counter at home or somewhere around the brewery when they have a moment.
And the inspiration in past years with cherry and vanilla and the berry medley we did for Backyard and cinnamon and cocoa nibs and all these flavors you can find in Bourbon County Stout. Maybe just little traces, or maybe something like vanilla really pops in bourbon.
If somebody said orange, I'd say, what kind of orange? You go to the supermarket, there's 5 kinds of oranges. And we tried to get down into detail instead of staying spice, which cinnamon, and trying to really get into that level of detail. When it's in a bourbon barrel for a year or so, you don't want to say, oh, I wish we'd have done this differently. And next year it'll taste better. We want to get it right the first time.
But we've covered a lot of that ground, and there's only so many individual little flavors that you can pick out. Through this process, we've started to now consider elements that aren't naturally found in Bourbon County Stout or bourbon itself. But we have to be mindful of the history of this beer and not go too far away from the fact that it's a bourbon-aged imperial stout. That's what it is at its core. We can't go so wild that people don't recognize it for what it is. Proprietors was about giving something back to Chicago and saying we're going to do something focused purely on Chicago, do something that is a little bit smaller batch so we can be a little bit more complex and nimble with it and do something that we wouldn't be able to do on a larger scale. Something like this beer it's more than just sitting down and sipping a glass. It's a social story. People remember those things. It's very awe-inspiring to hear people talk about, to have such reverence for this beer that I'm fortunate enough to be able to work with on a daily basis. Sometimes, though, we have the opportunity to do something different that is more about the barrel itself and not about the other ingredients that we're adding to it.
Bourbon County will always be a very special beer. But we wanted to make some more beers off that base. We said, what would be the biggest whale of all? What would be the coolest thing we could ever do? I'd known Julian Van Winkle from doing Whiskey Fest for many years in Chicago. Julian was somewhat of a legend, and especially for his 23-year-old stuff. And I said, Julian, what do you do with all those barrels? I said, why don't you give me those barrels next year?
They were indicating the pedigree of the barrel, which is very progressive, and it's still kind of coming around. And in 2010, when they did that, Pappy Van Winkles weren't selling for $2,000 in auctions in 2010.
Forget, don't worry about regret and just trust me.
So we got a hold of these Pappy barrels, and we said, okay, we're gonna leave them in there not for one season, but for 2 full years. When we ended up dumping those barrels, as great as Bourbon County was, this was different. This was velvet in your mouth. This was the creamiest, most luscious beer anybody had ever had, at least at our brewery. And we decided to release it on Black Friday, 2010. It was the day after Thanksgiving, really cold day in Chicago, and we had people lined up around the corner to get that first batch of Bourbon County Rare. The local news channels covered it a little bit. They were going down to like dive bars and asking people if they would ever pay $40 for a bottle of beer. They thought we were crazy.
Our question is, would you pay $45 for a bottle of beer?
Hell no, get the hell out of here. If you tell me I'm gonna pay $45 a beer, I'm gonna tell you to kiss, get the face, before I beat you.
My sentiments exactly.
Well, I think it was gone in about an hour and a half, maybe less. We did that once, and I thought there's no way we could ever top this. 23-year-old Pappy Van Winkle barrels, that's kind of the top of the list when it comes to bourbon barrels.
If you look at the hottest American whiskey brand in the world, well, who was working with it 5 years ago, before it was the hottest American whiskey brand in the world? Again, on it, know what's going on, seeing what's going on progressively in the whiskey world and combining that with what BCS was doing. Again, you know, groundbreaking.
I think that's about the highest experience I've had as a beer drinker, drinking Bourbon County Rare. I think an older barrel could be really fun. The Angel's taken not just her share, but enough share for everybody up in the clouds. So I don't know what it's going to taste like. It's going to taste different though, that's for sure.
A 35-year-old bourbon would be super tannic and super over-oaked, where the bourbon itself may not have been very enjoyable. The flavors that are still floating around in that barrel are probably uncommon, to say the least.
It starts with an opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to get this set of barrels that we never thought we'd have a crack at, that frankly we didn't know existed.
To find 35-year-old barrels in a bourbon warehouse is not the norm. So it's not something we planned. It wasn't a special product or anything like that.
And they came in and they looked, I don't know, they're just dark and dusty and dingy and really shabby looking barrels. You know, some of them were from, you know, the time around when I was born.
Go if you're gonna go, stay if you wanna stay.
I mean, they're special casks. You need to do something special to showcase these things and what they can bring into the final product.
The obvious thing to do, of course, is to fill them with BCS and let them sit for as long as we can.
We wanted to pay tribute to the previous Rare and that concept of a longer aged beer in the barrel.
And then the aging time of 2 years really lets the beer come over the hill and just become very sublime and deep and incredibly well integrated.
As you would imagine, it's a woodier, it's oakier. It is Bourbon County Stout first and foremost, but it is distinct. These barrels provided a different character.
If you wanna stay, but darling, you should know when a girl like
Would I say that you could find them again? Probably not, but I would never rule it out. It's 1.2 million barrel spaces, so you know anything can happen, but I just can't imagine we've got a bunch more of these barrels sitting out there.
I don't think we'll ever see a truckload of those pull up here ever again. So it's very special. And it'll probably be the only time we ever do it.
Life gives you things that you